Now, the next scene I want to point to is this ultimatum to Harfleur. This is in Act 3, Scene 3. The English, historically, and what we see in the play is the English invasion force landed at a beach a few miles west of Harfleur, and they began the siege on the August 18th, and the town surrendered on September 22nd. In the interim, the troops were so here's Harfleur here. The troops had been laying siege here, trying to live off some seafood they were getting on the shores here. Turned out they were, living somewhat malnourished. They were getting dysentery from this seafood. Maybe it's not the best stuff, and so their numbers are dwindling. Morale's low. Their numbers. The numbers that are effective are suffering from dysentery, what have you, for the rest of this march that they're going to go on to until the Battle of Agincourt here. So in this speech, what we see in Henry V, the play from Shakespeare, is Henry's cruelty in this ultimatum, the cruel treatment that he's threatening to exhibit on the townspeople if they do not surrender is often cited as another reason we should be critical him of or see Henry V in a critical light. So here's a depiction of the scene as it probably was staged. Remember, we've got that upper stage here that is often used as a balcony, as I mentioned in the Romeo and Juliet famous scene. Here, also used as part of the wall. So the governor and the men of Harfleur will be here, and Henry V is giving the speech we'll see down below. Now, I'll just mention that Olivier, so we have a couple of film versions that, were, let's say, somewhat popular film versions. First, in the 40s, Sir Laurence Olivier's film version was largely in the tradition of seeing this as a celebration of the English cause, almost war propaganda. Kenneth Branagh in '89, I believe, Kenneth Branagh did another film version that was less rah-rah about the war. I think it's somewhat questioning of it. You see, there's a side you can see Henry as being celebrated in the play to some extent, but there's definitely the dirty underside of the victories also portrayed. So for this speech, in order for Henry to come off as such a hero, Olivier had to cut this whole speech in that movie. A couple of things there. I think a powerful speech, obviously, and obviously really well delivered there by Kenneth Branagh, a great Shakespearean actor and director, of course. Now, this speech, in terms of the threats that are given to Harfleur, as I said, can be interpreted as part of this skeptical interpretation that we're supposed to see Henry V as somehow limited and flawed. You can see that a lot of that could be in the performance. So at the end, you can see this relief that Kenneth Branagh portrayed when he hears the reply from the governor that they're not going to try to defend themselves. So Henry will not need to make good on those threats. He'll be able to spare the town if he so chooses. And you can see that relief that this is the outcome he wanted and was hoping for. And that's one way it can be portrayed, right? And on the other hand, we can say that, well, even if he didn't want that to be the case, the fact that he's willing to have this as an outcome shows the ends to which someone would go, or Henry V would go for a military objective, and that the ends would justify such bloody means. This is very, let's say, ruthless. It's very Machiavellian in a negative sense, one could say. Let's look to the speech first of all, because in the film version, and you'll notice this if you try to compare notes of a film version or even a staged version with the text of Shakespeare, they, in order to compress it into the time of a movie or a staging, they have to cut out quite a bit. So about half of that speech was actually cut out in the version that we saw from Kenneth Branagh. So let's turn to it and make sure we catch it uh, and are able to piece it together. So here in the first few lines are lines that he does give. How yet resolves the governor of the town? This is the latest parle we will admit. Therefore, to our best mercy give yourselves, or like two men proud of destruction, defy us to our worst. For as I am a soldier, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best, if I begin the battery once again, I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur till in her ashes she lie buried. So I'll just note that for as I am a soldier, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best. So we're going to see Henry is able to play a lot of roles. We already saw in the Henry IV plays, we didn't study in class, but we've talked about them. He's able to play a certain role to become friends with the characters in Eastcheap and get to know them. He can play the role of a theologian. He can play the role of a policy advisor in discourse on political matters. He can talk about war. He can play the role of a soldier. And he says here, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best. It's a statement that none of these things is really his true character, but these are maybe roles he can assume. In the last scene, he's going to assume the role of a lover to court Catherine, the French princess. The gates of mercy, and this part of the speech was all cut. The gates of mercy shall be all shut up, and the fleshed soldier, rough and hard of heart, in liberty of bloody hand, shall range with conscience wide as hell, mowing like grass your fresh fair virgins and your flowering infants. So this is quite the image of the soldier, an image also from Homer's Iliad of two armies moving together and soldiers mowing one another down like scythes through grass. I think we looked at that simile in Homer's Iliad. Here, it's not mowing down other soldiers, though. The soldiers will go in and mow down your fair virgins and your flowering infants like grass. What is it then to me if impious war, arrayed in flames like to the prince of fiends, do with his smirched complexion all fell feats, in linked to waste and desolation? So on the impious war, I have a note there. I put a note on this compared to, let's say, the piety of the wars that we see in Virgil's Aeneid. And it's an impious war here, partly because it's a civil war. Harfleur is supposed to be English. Henry deems that town to be English, let's say, property or under English domain. So in a way, it's a civil war, and these civil wars are impious wars. What is it to me when you yourselves are cause, if your pure maidens fall into the hand of hot and forcing violation? What reign can hold licentious wickedness when down the hill he holds his fierce career? We may as bootless spend our vain command upon the enraged soldiers in their spoil as send precepts to the Leviathan to come ashore. Therefore, you men of Harfleur, take pay. This is where Brennan's performance picks up the speech again. Take pity of your town and of your people, whiles yet my soldiers are in my command, whiles yet the cool and temperate wind of grace o'erblows the filthy and contagious clouds of heady murder, spoil, and villainy. If not, why, in a moment, look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand desire the locks of your shrill shrieking daughters. your fathers taken by the silver beards, and their most reverent heads dashed to the walls, your naked infants spitted upon pikes, whiles the mad mothers with their howls confused do break the clouds, as did the wives of Jewry at Herod's bloody hunting slaughtermen. What say you? Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense be thus destroyed? So I think a couple of things. It begins, I think, in these last lines here to say the last 10 lines to become very graphic, and the language and the nature of the language plays upon it as well. So your shrill, shrieking daughters, you can almost hear them in that alliteration of the shrill and shrieking, hear the screams in that language. And your fathers taken by the silver beards, as I point out in the note here, reminiscent of what happens to Priam in book 2 of the Aeneid. So we remember that scene of just pure horror of Priam being killed in front of his wife Hecuba at this altar. Priam also being murdered after he had seen the death of his own son. So in this case, Henry V is placing himself in the position of this Greek sacrilegious destruction of Troy, and it's, in a sense, it's a repetition of that destruction of Troy. And as we know, the Greeks had to pay penance for that for years in terms of their nostoi, their return journeys. Agamemnon killed when he returns, Odysseus for 10 years on journey. And a line that in performance and well, even reading it has always given me chills down my spine, has been this, your naked infants spitted upon pikes, while the mad mothers with their howls confused to break the clouds. So obviously a horrible image, but also it's the image itself of the infants on the spikes, but also the image of these mad mothers, mad in the sense of being insane with grief, the image of the response to the murder. That's why, let's say, in the Aeneid, in depicting the death of Priam, it's not so much the death of Priam or his son, it's the reaction of the loved ones. It's the reaction of Hecuba to Priam being killed right in front of her eyes, and here it's the reaction of the mad mothers to their with confused howls as their young babies are spitted upon pikes. And their reaction here is like the wives of Jewry to the bloody hunting of Herod. So this is Herod trying to, after a prophecy of a Messiah to be born. This is recounted, of course, in the Gospels, and Herod would try to kill or forestall this Messiah by killing infants of Jewry, and here again, Henry V is not portraying himself as being on the right side of this history. He would, let's say, repeat that act of Herod. Now, the last lines I'll also just point to here. What say you? Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense? So I think there's a good essay, I think, with that title, an article with that title on what is just in war. So there's just war theory. So beginning in the Middle Ages, and we talked a bit about it with our lecture on modernity, and with a little bit of discussion on the Middle Ages. But there's just war theory in relation to your justification for going to war. So it's justice ad bellum, and then there's justice in bello. So within the war, what are just acts? So seizing a town or laying siege to a town is obviously a just act. It happens in every war, according to this theory. But a town that holds out on defense longer than it should, if it's not, quote unquote, and this is the response of the governor, if it's not defensible and it's just prolonging the suffering on both sides, then according to some authors of these different war treatises, the town is guilty in defense, and is their losses, if they're the enemy soldiers, once they do penetrate the walls and take over the town, if they're pillaged, if they're raped and murdered, the guilt is on them. They're guilty in their prolonging the defense. So part of this speech then could be seen as Henry trying to convince them not to go down that road, and that if he does end up having to do this and get his soldiers to be absolutely ruthless so that they take the town, that this would not be his fault. Again, part of the speech is him putting the responsibility on others. So it's kind of a Machiavellian maneuver in that sense, but it could also be seen as, in a traditional sense, this would be, quote unquote, a just act of war. It seems somewhat unbelievable to us to kind of parse this as a just act of war, but again, I repeat that it's historically, as well as in the literature, sieging cities, towns, and the ultimate fall of these cities after a siege is always the most bloody and horrible in literature, starting with Troy, the myth of what happens to a city once it's been taken over after a long siege. So, but Harfleur is not Troy. It has these parallels in the speech, but it ends up not being Troy. So first of all, MacMorris in Act 3, Scenes 2 said, "I would have blowed up the town so Krish saved me," he says. So one thing we could say is it's good to have this type of person in your army for battle. This person is so spirited, but it's decidedly an anti-Christian position. So you could say that Shakespeare saw that the Renaissance return to pagan values in its tension with Christian values was producing this conflict of two competing narratives. And in his treatment of Harfleur, he, in a way, he affects a good synthesis of it. You could say he threatens them with the type of destruction that they would have seen in kind of in what we see in pagan literature, in Troy, in the Iliad, and as depicted in the Aeneid. But he also, at the end, shows mercy. He says to Exeter, after, "Use mercy to them all." He commands. This is what he commands to Exeter after they've seized the town. And so obviously we can contrast this treatment of the city with the most famous classical example, Troy.